One of my favorite features of the PodGo is not something that maybe a lot of folks who originally bought it were actually buying it for. Most of us who buy modelers like the PodGo or even the Helix or HX Stomp for that matter are buying it as a guitar rig. We want to either play it through our existing guitar rig, through an FR speaker, maybe just through our studio monitors at home. But one feature that I realize a lot of folks maybe don't explore, or some may not even realize it's there, is that these devices, including the PodGo, make excellent audio interfaces for our computer. And they can be quite powerful once we understand how to use them. So one of my favorite features about the PodGo is its ability to be a great audio interface. And today, I'm going to take you through some of the steps into using it as such. And this is also going to apply in a lot of ways, maybe with some tweaks, to the HX Stomp and also the Helix. So I'm going to take you through the steps on how to get it set up with your computer so that it's working properly, and also to use with a digital audio workstation or a DAW. So without further ado, let's take a look. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is head on over to the Line 6 website and download the appropriate software. In this case, since we're talking about the PodGo, we're going to want to get PodGo Edit. Once we have that and we install it on our computer, you're going to see that that is going to install both the PodGo Edit software and the appropriate audio driver that we'll need for the PodGo to be able to talk to our computer and recognize it, so that we'll have it as a selection within our DAW and we can set it as our audio interface. So here we are over in Cubase Pro. Now this is my DAW of choice. So many of you may have other ones. Some of you folks might use Reaper or Studio One or GarageBand, or I don't really know. But all DAWs are going to have that same sort of thing in common, where we need to tell the DAW what audio interface we're using, or else it's not going to communicate with it. So I've seen a lot of folks have troubles where they say, well, I'm not getting any sound in, I'm not getting any sound out, and they forgot the first step, which is now that we have our audio drivers installed, we need to tell our DAW what audio interface we're using. So if I come up to Cubase here, I will go to the Studio tab. I will go to Studio Setup, and you'll notice here there's an Audio System tab. And right here it says ASIO Driver, and it says ASIO PodGo. So I've already selected the PodGo, but if I do a pull-down menu here, I have choices: no driver, and all the drivers that I have installed previously on my computer: ASIO Helix, ASIO HX Stomp, ASIO PodGo, Axe.io ASIO, and for the Fractal FM3. I'm already set to PodGo. If I wanted to use the Helix, I would choose the Helix. If I want to use HX Stomp, I would choose it, but we're going to go with PodGo. Also, what it tells you here is the input and output latency. It also gives you some other information, such as the sample rate you're dealing with. Now, if I go down to ASIO PodGo here and hit Control Panel, this is where I can adjust my buffer size. Going extra small is going to put more stress on your CPU. So if you don't have a very powerful computer, this may not work. You may get audio glitches and stuttering sounds, but your latency will be a lot lower. If we set it much higher, our CPU usage will be less and our computer won't have to work as hard, but our latency will be more. The latency may or may not be an issue depending on what you're trying to do. We can also direct monitor, which we will talk about shortly. So I'm going to set it right around there, hit apply, and that is ready to go now. It also here under the ports shows that we have a total of 4 inputs and 4 outputs that we can choose, and they show which ones are active and inactive within our project, and that can change after. So I'm going to hit OK. I should be all set. One other thing we want to do then is assign our inputs and outputs. If I come back to the Studio tab and hit the Audio Connections, I can also hit F4 on my keyboard. We get the Audio Connections tab, and you'll notice here we have inputs and we have outputs. I'm using the control room feature. So I have my studio monitors plugged into the main outputs of the PodGo. That's going to be coming out on output 1 and 2. So I've set output 1 and 2 to monitor everything that I am playing through here. So if I am just plugged into my PodGo as I am here, it is monitoring what's coming out of those main outputs. I'm plugged into Guitar In. I'm going through my Line 6 Metal Through the Decades PodGo preset. I believe it's the 90s metal preset. That's what you're hearing. And it's out to those. And we get our sound. If we come over to PodGo Edit and come to the end block here, we notice this is set to main out. And that's exactly where it is going to be going to. We also have inputs that need to be set. So what is going to happen is we want to set these to record on certain tracks. So what I'm going to show you here is that we can set this up for one of my favorite features, and that's the ability to reamp. This has saved me so many times when doing sessions, when doing demos. Sometimes I've recorded guitar tracks using the PodGo, but I want to rerun those through the HX Stomp, let's say, or through Helix Native, or through the Helix, or maybe through a different modeler altogether. I don't have to re-record those if I have recorded the dry direct signal from our guitar. I always have it, so I always do this, even if I don't think I'm going to need it. Maybe I used a tone in a session and the producer gets back to me, or the engineer gets back to me, the artist, they love the performance, but they would prefer a slightly more distorted or less distorted tone. I wouldn't have to redo the whole performance. I could just reamp the signal. So I'm going to show you how to do that, and that'll give us a good idea how the PodGo can work as an audio interface. Now you'll notice when I was playing, even though the latency is set slightly high, I'm not noticing that because I'm monitoring directly from the PodGo, which allows us to not have to worry as much about those latency settings if we're performing through the PodGo preset. So how can we record with the ability to reamp? Well, here's how we're going to do this. First thing we're going to do is we are going to add new tracks. Now I want to keep this little dialog open. So I want to add a stereo track since this is a stereo preset. I don't know how much stereo information there is on there. Maybe if we threw a delay or something on, it would be more so, but we'll leave it as stereo for now. So I'm going to go in to our stereo input 1 and 2. So it's going to capture what's coming out of my preset in stereo. I'm going to select that as my input, and I'm going to label that as guitar. I'm going to add that track. But at the same time, I want to capture the dry, unprocessed guitar signal as well. So for this, I'm going to actually change my configuration to mono because that signal is just going to be my mono dry guitar. Very interesting thing on the PodGo, much like the Helix, USB 7 for the Helix, I believe USB 5 for the HX Stomp, and for the PodGo, it's going to be USB 3 and 4. If we wanted stereo, we could use both, but I don't need that. I'm just going to use input 3. So now by setting that to input 3, I'm going to name this guitar underscore DI. We've now set a track, and I'm done with my track adding dialog. Now I have set up 2 different tracks now. If I've set this correctly with this capturing USB 1, 2 inputs and this capturing USB 3, this should get my processed sound and this should get my dry direct guitar tone. All right, so here's how that would work then. I would arm both of these for recording. Now, here's the thing. If I monitor these from the DAW, what's going to happen is we will then have some latency because the signal is going into the DAW, back into the PodGo before we hear it. So whatever round trip latency we have, that's going to affect the sounds. I don't want to bother using the monitoring, and that's why I just don't really worry too much where this is set, to be totally honest with you, most of the time. If I don't monitor here, I'm going to be monitoring straight directly from the PodGo with no latency, but it will still record onto that track. So now I've armed both of these. If I start recording and then play a track, you will notice that I will get my processed signal up here on the first track and my unprocessed DI'd signal here on the second track. Let's try that. All right, so if we go listen back now to those tracks, I'm going to solo the first track and you're going to hear precisely what you heard me play. Now, if I stop that, unsolo that, and solo the guitar DI, you'll hear my unprocessed track. Now, you say, great, I have that. I may never need that guitar DI track, but it's there if I need it. So what we have up here is the tone I had coming out of the PodGo, recorded beautifully, effortlessly into my DAW. Obviously, I can add as many of these tracks as I want and just continue to layer and work however I wanted to. And it works beautifully on playback and on recording. What happens though if I wanted to actually use the PodGo for another really great purpose and one of my favorite features, to actually reamp that DI'd guitar track? Let's say I wanted a different tone. So what I would do in this case is I would take those off record enable. We're going to mute our main guitar track, is really what we're interested in is this. But here's the problem. We don't want this coming out of our main output anymore, because that main output doesn't actually get processed within our PodGo. The reason for that is if I want to just play back my drums and bass, let's say, from my DAW, or maybe I want to jam with Spotify or YouTube, something else coming from my computer, I don't want that to be processed by this 90s metal tone. So USB 1.2 is never processed through this path. It just goes through in an unprocessed manner. So right now, by sending this out, the stereo out like it is, it's going to be unprocessed. So we need to send this out in a way that it can be processed. So we need to go back up to our audio connections dialog. And I want to go to outputs this time. And I'm going to add a bus. I'm going to add a mono output bus, say add bus, and make sure that this is assigned to output number 3. So now that we've created this mono output 3, we want to assign our guitar DI track to go out of that mono output. And the nice thing is too, if you find this confusing, you can even come over here and name this and say, guitar reamp output. And then when we come over here, we can choose guitar reamp as the output. Now, once we've done that, we won't hear this playback anymore. You'll notice our track still has the information of our raw DI'd guitar track, but we're not hearing it. And that's because we're not sending it out our main outputs anymore. So to get sound out of that, we have to now go over to PodGo Edit and do one final step that's very important. I want to process it through this chain. Maybe I want to switch to a different one, but we'll just keep it as this is for now. I go to my input block, and instead of having the input block going from my guitar input, which my guitar is plugged into, I want it accepting the USB 3. So now, if you think about it, we have Cubase sending this DI guitar track out, that output we set, which we assigned to USB 3, and we now have the PodGo accepting the input as USB 3. So we're going to get that same guitar, dry DI'd guitar hitting the front of this path and recording back on USB 1.2. So now that I've done that, when I press play on this DI track, we should hear it processed through the PodGo tone. You'll notice as soon as I switch to guitar, it doesn't do it anymore. Now that I've done that, I could come over here. Let's loop this just so it doesn't stop. And we could then do something like this where we audition different tones. Always having to set the input to USB 3.4. Now, let's say we've decided that that modern metal tone is more appropriate for what we want. All I have to do is add a new track, a stereo track on stereo 1.2. We'll call it Guitar Reamp Modern. We open that track, we arm it for recording, then we can just simply do this. when we're done, we've now recorded with that new tone. So now if I mute this, so what we've done is we've sent the DI'd guitar out of USB 3, assigned PodGo to accept USB 3. It feeds it back out to the USB 1.2 that I'll be recording on here, and we get our track. So now I have the exact same performance, one with the 90s metal tone, one with the modern metal tone. And if I just get rid of that, I will play this and I will solo back and forth between the two tones. You'll hear the same performance played through the different presets. And we can do that all day long until we're happy with the tone we have, but we didn't have to go back and re-perform it. So all of that functionality is built right into our PodGo. So I don't know if some of you folks found that useful. I find that's a great tool, and it's one I receive a lot of questions about, and folks ask me how I can do it. Now, this same thing will apply, like I mentioned before, to our HX Stomp and our Line 6 Helix. Helix feeds its DI'd guitar by default out of USB 7. I believe HX Stomp is USB 5. But the same principles will apply in our DAW about setting inputs and outputs. The same signal path. We would send an output and then set our inputs on either our Helix and our HX Stomp to accept that back in, and then process it however we want. That's a very powerful tool to have built into the device. I see a lot of folks buy a PodGo and then they'll say, what audio interface do I need to record with this? Now, to be honest with you, they are fairly simple audio interfaces. Something like a PodGo doesn't have an XLR mic input, so if we need something to record a microphone or, extra inputs, of course we may still need an external audio interface. But it's nice to know that built into things like the PodGo, the HX Stomp, we do have a very useful audio interface that can get us by in a lot of situations. If I was simply using virtual instruments such as, some of my favorite tune tracks, Superior Drummer 3, Easy Bass, Easy Keys, creating backing tracks and just recording guitar parts over it, I could do that with nothing but a PodGo and get absolutely stellar results from it with no issues whatsoever. But again, of course, if we need, microphone preamps and more inputs, yes, we would have to go up to a much more full-featured audio interface. But I just wanted to point that out because it is something I get questioned about a lot. And a lot of folks, if they didn't realize that's there, maybe they're going to spend money to get the functionality that they didn't know existed in their device that they already have. So I hope that was helpful. I hope you guys liked that. Please like the video and share it with anybody who you think would get some use out of watching it. Also, please subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put more content out. I will be back really soon with some more. Thank you guys so much again for tuning in. Ciao for now.